So you want to get a blurry background. You might have even noticed that this background is slightly blurry, and it can get much blurrier than that, and you are going to learn exactly how to do that in this video. Basically, learning how to do the blurry background effect, or a shallow depth of field, or bokeh as many people call it, is actually a giant science mumbo-jumbo thing, but we're not going to get into that. We're going to talk about practically how you can actually apply all that science to getting your own blurry background. And if that sounds interesting to you, let's get into it. Now, once you have broken down all the secret science sauce that goes into making a camera do the blurry background stuff, there are really only 3 things you need to know. Now, the first one of that, and by far the most important one, is to move as far away from your background as physically possible. The farther away you are, the blurrier the background is going to be. This is a basic rule of thumb, and if you're ever shooting with a phone, it's probably the most important thing, because at the end of the day, with a phone, it's probably the only thing you can control. The next 2 things are pretty tough to control with a phone, but they are also very important. Now you might be thinking, James, panic, all I have to film in is a tiny cramped apartment, or a really small bedroom, or an office, or maybe I'm actually trapped in a cave and I live in it with Tom Hanks on an island in Castaway. Well, if any of those things are the case, these next 2 tips are going to be your savior, because if you can't move extremely far away, you can do one of the next 2 things to fix the situation. The first of which is the aperture on your camera lens. You might have noticed that on your camera lens, somewhere, there's a little number that says F followed by a number. Usually it'll be, maybe a 1.8, or it'll have a range of numbers, but you look for that. Basically, your goal is to buy a camera lens that has the smallest F number possible. That's called your f-stop, and it basically is a designator for how much light your camera is going to take in. Now, I'm not going to go into depth about that. If you want an in-depth video, let me know down in the comments. I will definitely make an extremely in-depth video at a later date. But basically, the simplified version is, the smaller the number, the more blurry background you're going to get, and the closer you can be to your background. So if you're shooting indoors, you're really going to want something between an f1.2 and an f1.8. Now, lenses go from f1.2 all the way up to like f40, so there is a broad range, and there's a good chance that whatever lens you're using probably isn't in that optimal range for getting a blurry background indoors, and that's okay. It's just going to be more difficult to get the blurry background effect with a higher f-stop rating on your camera lens. If you're curious about what camera lens I'm using in this video, and you'd like to go and, pick it up, I'm not sponsored, but at the very end of this video, I will give you some recommendations and talk about specifics, so stick around. Now, for the third and final thing that is important for getting this blurry background. It is the focal length, or essentially the length of your lens. Now, you'll also notice on all of your lenses that there are measurements for how long they are. Like, for example, the lens we're shooting with right now is 50 millimeters. Maybe you have an 80 to 200 millimeter adjustable lens. It could be anything, but the longer the lens, the more blurry of a background you're going to be able to get. But there is a downside to having a longer lens. First of all, most longer lenses tend to have higher f-stop ratings, which means that the aperture isn't going to be as ideal for getting the blurry background. Now, the other thing is, even if you can find one and all else is created equal, the longer the lens, the harder it's going to be to set up indoors, because that camera is going to have to be really far away from your face. Otherwise, you're going to be zoomed in on your nose hairs, and everybody's going to think it's weird. So I'm actually going to, real quick, do an experiment for you. I have an adapter for my camera that we're using right now that can turn my 50mm lens into an 85mm lens. So what we're going to do is I'm going to transition the shot to that, and you're going to see just how different it really is. Now, the shot you are looking at right now is exactly the same as the prior shot, with one difference, and that is the camera lens has been lengthened using an adapter from 50mm to 85, so now it's longer, and essentially what that ends up doing is cropping the photo down, and the background gets a lot blurrier, but that does come at the cost of, obviously having a much more cropped look. So in order to uncrop this, I would essentially have to move the camera back probably another 6 feet or so in order to get the same shot. So if you are going to get a longer camera lens, just make sure that you have enough room to actually shoot with it. Otherwise, you're going to end up taking a video of nothing but your nose hairs, and it's going to be kind of weird. So keep that in mind. Now for a quick bonus tip to add a little bit of extra blur to your background. If you get some sort of, Christmas lights or really dim lights like an Edison bulb, and you put it way in the background and you turn them on, they're going to add kind of like light splotches around that make it look more blurry while on camera. So I don't have any back here, but you're more than welcome to play with it, and it will make it look a little bit more blurry. Now, that was a lot of information to take in all at once, so let's do a little recap. The first and most important thing for getting a blurry background is to move as far away from your background as physically possible. Now, this is extremely important if you're using a phone, because on most phones you won't be able to adjust the next 2 settings. The next thing to do is to secure a lens with a very low f-stop rating. Anything 1.8 or below, 1.8 to 1.2, is going to be perfect for indoor shooting. Now, if you're outdoors, it doesn't really matter. You can make it as long as possible because your background's going to be so far away. And finally, a longer lens or longer focal length is going to be great for getting a blurry background with the cost of having to move the camera much further away from your face. Otherwise, you're going to end up just zooming in on nose hairs. And finally, for those curious as to what lens this video is being filmed with, it is the Nifty 50 or Plastic Fantastic lens by Canon. Essentially what it is a 50mm 1.8 aperture lens made by Canon that's extremely cheap. The term Plastic Fantastic is there for a reason, because the entire lens casing is made out of plastic, and it feels cheap, but it's only $125, and it performs outstandingly well when it comes to getting a blurry background indoors when you don't have a ton of room to work with. For example, this shot that you're currently watching right now, the camera is about 5.5 feet in front of me, and the background is probably a good 6 feet behind me, which is about the distance that you have available in an average room. But yet, it still does a pretty good job at getting a blurry background. Now, if you had a much longer lens, you would have a huge issue with this. I'd probably have to be 10 feet further from the background, and the camera would probably have to be another 10 feet in front of me in addition to that. Now, hold on. Everybody in the comments who's a camera expert is probably sitting there thinking, no, James, this is not the best lens. There are exactly identical replicas of this lens for much, much cheaper, even as much as like a quarter of the price. Well, fun fact for all of you, I actually initially bought one of those lenses. I have it right here in this box. It is the Yongnuo digital copy of the lens that we're using right now. It is also a 50mm f1.8 aperture lens that is made by some random Chinese knockoff company, and I bought it directly from China for like $30 when I first started, thinking, oh, it's exactly the same. But let me tell you, that is not the case at all. This lens here, this Yongnuo something or another lens, is terrible when it comes to 2 things. Number 1, shooting video with any sort of autofocus. And here's why. Basically, the autofocus is so slow that if I move my head even like a millimeter at a time, it will really badly focus after I'm completely done moving. And then, on top of that, the autofocus mechanism in the lens is so loud that all you will hear is the lens focusing, whereas, as you can tell right now, I did just move, and the lens focused on my face. It might not be perfect, but you don't hear the entire time on the audio, which is why I ended up just immediately buying this lens, and I couldn't return this one because I bought it on like Alibaba or something, and it had 4 weeks shipping with no returns. So don't buy that lens unless you plan on just taking photos with it, because it's not ideal. Now, if you're interested in subscribing and kind of joining our channel, basically what it is me, who just started a channel a few months ago doing something else. It's called Fun Fact of the Day. I'll have it linked below. I'm going through all of the struggles and issues that I've had and all the things that I've learned and teaching you about them. So it's more of a down-to-earth, learn-together style of video. So if that interests you, click the subscribe button, click the like button, and click the link right here for a whole bunch of other videos on how to make YouTube videos. Thank you, and I will see you soon.